After the hospital had folded and, you know, he'd lost everything, I heard him say that was probably the saddest time of his life.
But in good times and in bad, Edgar Cayce never lost his prophetic touch. In fact, another set of readings, which had issued from his sleeping form in the 1920s, proved so astounding that they still resonate today and may yet turn modern history upside down. For 43 years of his life, Edgar Cayce would lie down on a couch, place his hands on his solar plexus, and fall into a self-induced trance. In this state, he traveled through space and time, foretelling wars, diagnosing illnesses, and, in some of his most intriguing readings, rewriting history.
When we consider Edgar Cayce's predictions, it's also interesting to look at some of the retrocognitive statements he made, looking back into history and making statements about things you wouldn't find in the history book.
Cayce seemed to know secrets about the past that only high-tech instruments and years of excavating could reveal. Long before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, he spoke of an ancient sect of Judaism, the Essenes, which experts of the time believed was made up exclusively of men.
Edgar Cayce spoke about the Essenes as a community that included men, women, and children.
The experts remained dubious, but in the 1950s, years after Cayce's death, skeletons of Essene women were unearthed near the site where the scrolls were found.
With geology, there are some interesting things as well. Cayce suggested that at one time the Nile River flowed in the opposite direction and actually emptied directly into the Atlantic Ocean.
Amazingly, in the 1980s, satellite images from the space shuttle revealed unknown river valleys beneath the driest parts of the Sahara. More imaging and on-site exploration have demonstrated that the Nile may indeed have once flowed through the desert and into the Atlantic.
In Edgar Cayce's lifetime, much of what he said about lost civilizations, ancient worlds, was regarded as science fiction. It really wasn't until this century, on literally the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that people have begun to look much harder and realistically at these readings as perhaps, well, maybe these aren't so far-fetched.
Probably the most intriguing readings Cayce gave were on the subject of the lost land of Atlantis.
Atlantis, from Edgar Cayce's perspective, was the first great Eden on the earth. It predates the Eden that we know of between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Eden of Adam and Eve. Edgar Cayce saw Atlantis as a massive continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, the individuals that populated the area had a deep understanding of the forces of the universe and could actually harness some of these powers to use devices such as flying machines and crystals and so forth.
But according to the readings, the Atlanteans abused their power over nature. As a result, Atlantis disappeared in a cataclysmic disaster some 10,000 years ago. Cayce's most specific prophecy in terms of date asserted a part of Atlantis would rise again in 1968. It didn't. But that year, a strange formation known as the Bimini Road was discovered in the Bahamas.
Most geologists think it's beach rock. Beach rock is rock that fractures parallel to the shore. Well, this is parallel to the shore, but the end of it curves around in a kind of a J shape, so that's unusual.
No conclusive evidence has yet been amassed that proves Atlantis lies beneath the Bahamas. But according to Cayce, Bimini isn't our only link to the lost continent. Before the final destruction, he said, Atlanteans hid records of their earliest history in other locations.
One was in the Yucatan Peninsula, the other was off the right front paw of the Sphinx in Egypt.
In the early 1990s, Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology at Boston University, conducted geological and seismic surveys on the Sphinx.
I was not in the business to support Edgar Cayce or any other, I'll call him psychic or prophet. I really knew nothing about him other than his name.
Schoch and his team were about to make an interesting discovery.
We were able to model what was underneath the Great Sphinx. We found under and in front of the left paw of the Sphinx what I believe is a major chamber, maybe up to 25 meters below the surface. Based on its regularity, it looks like it was human carved, and not only is it definitely there, but it seems to have something in it. The way it resonated, the way it ringed, seems to indicate there's something in the chamber.
Is it the Atlanteans' Hall of Records that Casey spoke of? No one has explored the matter further, and as fascinating as they are, Casey's Atlantis prophecies have so far not been vindicated. However, it is possible that Casey's method and not his material will have the most far-reaching effect on our understanding of ourselves and the world we inhabit. In fact, he suggested that with practice, we could all do what he did.
I do not believe there is a single individual that does not possess this same ability I have. If they would only be willing to pay the price of detachment from self-interest that it takes to develop those abilities.
Casey was even able to describe where he got the information that came to him in trance. He said it came from the subconscious mind of the individual he was reading for, and from the Akashic records, a universal source of knowledge that holds all the pasts, presents, and unfolding futures of mankind.
Edgar Casey said, ultimately, when you view it from the highest dimension, there is no time and no space. There is no future and no past. It all is occurring in one fascinating moment of expression, but time is an illusion that has purpose.
Casey's readings also suggested that we could have an impact on the future. This radical notion was shared by Nostradamus.
Edgar Casey and Nostradamus both shared the belief that the future was malleable, changeable. It's also true that if you're a prophet, you're also a propagandist. You're trying to persuade, often, the future to change.
Why would Casey want the future to be changed, and what cataclysmic prophecies did he make for the third millennium?
Edgar Casey made some extraordinary and spectacular Earth change predictions, something that would be catastrophic, probably even beyond what we could imagine.
From Nostradamus to the Mayan priests, prophets and prophetic traditions the world over warn of cataclysmic planet changes that will soon be upon us.
The ancient Mayans had a sense that there would come a time, about in these times in which we're living now, that would include tremendous destruction. They speak about the day of the withered fruit and the great tempest, things that sound rather scary.
The Hopi Indians speak of trees dying and dramatic changes in the weather that will bring in the day of purification. Nostradamus speaks of the dead rising from their graves, and Mother Shipton warns,
"Storms shall rage and oceans roar, old worlds shall die and new be born."
Casey's predictions for the new millennium are every bit as dire as all the other prophets who preceded him.
Edgar Casey made some extraordinary and spectacular Earth change predictions. Probably the biggest one was that the rotational axis of the Earth would change. And that's something that would be catastrophic, probably even beyond what we could imagine if that took place literally.
If the tilt axis of the Earth shifted slightly, the entire mass of the Earth would have to reconfigure itself. It would shift ocean basins, it would shift where valleys are, where mountains are.
Some of Casey's visions of the future are truly terrifying.
He speaks of Japan going into the ocean, inundations for southeastern United States, perhaps in a very slow way, but a permanent kind of inundation.
He also said the American East Coast would not be spared.
Portions of the now east coast of New York, or New York City itself, will in the main disappear. This will be another generation, though. Here, while the southern portions of Carolina, Georgia, these will disappear. This will be much sooner.
He also suggests that Europe would change either geologically or climatologically in the twinkling of an eye.
Casey actually foresaw these as part of the shifting of the poles. He stated that the Great Lakes would flow down through the Mississippi Valley system and from there flow right into the Gulf.
Le cose sono cambiate dall'epoca. Pensa che il primo vincitore è stato il reverendo Gore. Ah, non lo sapevo questo.
Dopo messa.
Spencer Gore, non sapevo che fosse
quindi c'è grande differenza tra il basket maschile e il basket femminile.
Decisamente.
Il tennis cosa propone? Propone una distanza differente, il 2 su 3 per le donne e il 3 su 5 per i maschi, però alla fine devono coprire lo stesso spazio, mi ripeto, la rete la devono superare allo stesso modo e quindi questo la francese dovrebbe averlo ben chiaro per cercare di dar filo da torcere alla
Jankovic contro la Martinez, Sanchez e poi ovviamente il canale 208 dove almeno una volta bisogna andare, la diretta risultati che arrivano in tempo reale dagli altri campi. Jankovic sul campo 3 2-2 con la Martinez Sanchez, sul campo 2 Stepanek sta vincendo 2-1 su Verdasco, la Vinci purtroppo sta perdendo 3-0 nel cos'era Petkovic? Solo l'ula hop e poi c'era tutto. Dunque vittoria come pronostico della tedesca 2-0. Adesso ci fermiamo per qualche minuto e poi sotto con il nostro Flavio Cipolla. L'impegno è duro, però noi ci crediamo. Tra poco affronterà l'argentino Del Potro, 6-1 nel primo set per l'argentino, 3-1 per l'azzurro.
Allora riassumo: Davide Cipolla contro Golia Del Potro. Ti piace?
Mi piace, vedremo un po' come andrà a finire. Siamo davvero contenti di avere
il che vuol dire che questa giocatrice è proprio imposta tutto il suo gioco sulla potenza, un gioco